OK, it's time now to turn to some of the week's other top stories and indeed today's main developments. And we'll start in the UK, where the general election this week saw Prime Minister David Cameron return to number 10 for another 5 years. But it didn't take long for people to react.
Withdraw! Withdraw!
Well, the Conservative Party emerged as the surprise winner in Thursday's election, and the protesters were angry about the party's looming spending cuts. Another thing that Cameron has promised will now happen is this.
We will deliver that in-out referendum on our future in Europe.
David Cameron has been a thorn in the side of the EU for quite a while now. His talk of controlling immigration has put Angela Merkel on edge. She said that she would rather see the UK leaving the Union. And when Britain was presented with a €1.7 billion bill from the European Commission last year, well, Cameron said that that was unacceptable. Analysts think that the UK's shaky relations with the EU could spell trouble for businesses.
I think there's clearly some uncertainty now for businesses. I think this will mean that they will consider very carefully whether they continue to invest in the United Kingdom, particularly for some of the big manufacturing industry, which is clearly serving the European market, not the British market.
Not long after the results of the election began to trickle in, it became obvious that the race wasn't going to be neck and neck. However, in the run-up to the election, well, the polls had widely predicted a close tussle between the Tories and Labour. However, they clearly got it wrong.
There's going to be an inquiry, actually, into why the polls got it wrong. Once again, we have an underestimation of just how big the Conservative vote was going to be. The Conservative didn't actually do fantastically well. What they did was they took seats from the Liberal Democrats, who essentially lost right across the room, was completely destroyed. Labour did very little. So why the polls got it wrong, I don't know. But everyone, including myself, was saying it looked like it was going to be a dead heat up until an exit poll came out and said it looked certain that the Conservatives were going to get a very narrow overall majority.
Stay with us here on RT International as we take a look at the asylum seeker crisis in Paris. Thousands from Africa and the Middle East have chosen the French capital as their waypoint on their journey to Britain. We'll bring you the full story a little later this hour. But before that, Israeli activists are accusing the country's army of firing indiscriminately during last year's 7-week war in Gaza. A new report is based on the accounts of more than 60 IDF soldiers who were directly involved.
The rules of engagement were open fire everywhere, first thing when you go in.
We didn't know they were inside.
People who look at you from the window of a house, they, to put it mildly, won't look anymore.
Well, those were extracts from a report by a group called Breaking the Silence. We spoke to its coordinator, a former IDF soldier himself.
We had very clear rules of engagement, which stated that unless a suspect is carrying arms and is endangering you, you are not allowed to shoot. Once we approached the soldiers that participated in the last operation, they told us a very different story. The guiding principle in this operation was that once they enter the strip, if they see any person, they need to shoot immediately because the military dropped pamphlets warning the Palestinian civilians that they have to leave. And therefore, in the eyes of the military, whoever is still there in the neighborhood has to be a militant. Most of the soldiers that came forward did not come, I guess, claiming that they were coming there, you know, wanting to kill uninvolved civilians. Basically, they were lied by their commanders. It wasn't intentional in a lot of the cases, especially when I'm talking about the approach of the individual soldiers. It was indiscriminate, but that obviously is fundamentally different than being intentional.
The Israeli army says that the activists have failed to provide any proof of their claims. Although Israel has been previously accused by the UN and human rights groups of disregarding civilian lives during the operation called Protective Edge. That lasted 50 days and it killed more than 1,000 civilians. Just take a look at these images behind me, which show the scale of the devastation inflicted on Gaza by those Israeli airstrikes. The Palestinians have since formally joined the International Criminal Court in The Hague with the aim of prosecuting Israel for alleged war crimes. My colleague Katie Pilbeam spoke to security analyst and former British Army officer Charles Shoebridge about the actions of the Israeli forces.
Largest number of those were not killed in close combat with the Israeli army. They were killed by airstrikes, artillery and other heavy weapon fire at a distance at which the target could not possibly be said to be posing a threat to those soldiers who fired. So really we have to take this report, which is bad enough in itself, in a context of, in many ways, a much greater culpability in the terms of this very indiscriminate use of not close-range weapons, as many of the soldiers on the ground were describing, but the heavy weapons which cause, of course, these great numbers of civilian casualties.
Here's one quote from one of the soldiers then. I'll read it to you. So the rules of engagement are pretty identical. Anything inside the Gaza Strip is a threat. The area has to be sterilised. Now, as a former military officer yourself, can you imagine giving an order to sterilise one of the most populated places on Earth? There is this, if you like, seems to be a differential between the value of some lives and the value of others, those that seem to be allied to us. And remember that during this campaign, the US and the UK, for example, totally backed the Israelis, although later there was some, if you like, concern about the disproportionality and the high death toll. But they absolutely backed what was going on. And of course, the Americans even supplied these weaponry. And when you have such good intelligence systems as the Israelis have, including drones, satellite images and so on, in signals intelligence, when you have such good precision weaponry supplied largely by the United States, there really can be no excuse or understanding of the very high proportion of civilian deaths other than some degree either of recklessness or intent.
Still to come, we'll bring you details of a deadly shooting in Texas outside a controversial exhibition as Islamic State sympathisers targeted an event showcasing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. We'll bring you that story and more in just a few moments.